Thanks. I think I'm going to get started. Thank you all for joining us this morning. As I mentioned, we are going to be talking about the lessons learned in developing a future-fit classroom. The specific focus is going to be around some of the work that was done by the Telkom Foundation. But we are going to be focusing a lot more on some of the lessons learned, particularly with regard to the ICT implementation for educators, as well as the psychosocial support that was provided and creating resilience with learners. What we're going to do is, so my name is Riyad Ibrahim, and I'm the host for this webinar. Following my introduction, I'm going to hand over to our three panelists for their opening comments. We'll then dive into the discussion, and I'll draw as many of your questions as possible from the Q&A box for response from our panel. I'd like you to please use the Q&A function as much as possible with regard to any questions that you have. As opposed to the chat, because that allows me to pull up those questions a lot more easily to the panelists. But if you do, and also we'll be able to respond to that. The panelists will be able to respond to some of the questions in the Q&A, and others will bring up on screen. I'm going to be joined shortly by Sarah Mtinzu who's the head of the Telkom Foundation, as well as Omashani Naidu, the executive director of SchoolNet, and Lynn Gaywood, who's the director of Childline Gauteng. We're going to spend the first sort of 20 minutes with chatting through the program and some of the lessons learned, and then we'll get into the Q&A for the balance of the session. I'm going to first start by pulling up a poll. I'd just like to get a sense of who's in the room. So I'd like to know, which organization do you represent? Abdullah, if you can pull up that poll, please. Thank you. All right. Just a brief about Trialogue. I'm sure most of you feel like old friends by now, but for the newcomers, Trialogue is one of the few consultancies that focuses exclusively on responsible business. We do this through consulting services as well as through knowledge sharing platforms, all of which aim to make corporate social investment in South Africa more effective. On the knowledge sharing platforms, Trialogue convenes the annual Business in Society conference, which was hosted in May this year. We also publish the annual Business in Society handbook, which you are invited to profile your development work in, and the Trialogue Knowledge Hub, which is an online body of knowledge that seeks to unpack specific topics in development and is aimed at strengthening the impact of investment in those areas. The write-up and the recording of this webinar will be uploaded onto the Trialogue Knowledge Hub. Cool, I see we've got quite a bit of participants, thank you. I'm going to pull up the second poll, and while I pull up the second poll, I'm going to dig into today's webinar in a bit more detail. So we specifically wanted to get info about the Connected Schools program, with a focus on the lessons learned through the process that we can share with other corporates and NPOs working in this space. The program is quite big, and so in the limited time that we have, we decided that we're not going to focus on everything, but we thought that it would be interesting to talk through two aspects of the program that at face value don't seem to have a strong relationship with each other. We will be chatting through the ICT skills for educators, as well as the psychosocial support program that was targeted at learners. And we will be tying all of this together with a perspective of what the future fit classroom really looks like. Now, often when we talk about a future fit space, we tend to think of a whole lot of technology in the hands of learners and teachers that are either non-existent or playing a very minimal role. But in reality, the future classroom is probably a place where we are building the resilience of learners to adapt to a fast-changing world, and teachers that are teaching with more tools that are made available to them through the modern world. So Abdullah, if you can pull up the results from the second poll. Thanks. All right, so just to set the scene, so all of this information is available, is pulled up from the Trialogue Business in Society Handbook, the research of which is underway at the moment, and I will chat about that a little bit towards the end of the webinar. But essentially what we're seeing from 2022 and 2023 is going to probably follow a similar pattern. Education is still the kind of receives the bulk of CSI spend. Approximately 98% of companies support education in some shape or form, and about 44% of total CSI spend is directed towards education. We also find that ECD and tertiary education receive 27% and 30% of CSI spend respectively, with general education receiving about 19%. In terms of the subject areas that are most supported, we find that maths and science still receives the lion's share of subject-related funding in education, followed by more general support. In terms of the types of interventions that are supported, learner development makes up about 18% of education spend, followed by teacher development and infrastructure. Whole school development and ICT only receives about 4% of total CSI spend. Most learner support interventions are outside of the school hours, at about 49%, and about 34% of interventions directly serving learners during school hours. Besides the ICT support, there is also a tremendous need for psychosocial support that Telkom realized at the start of the program. Now, on screen are some of the presenting problems that learners faced at the start of the program, and Len Kaywood will be speaking a bit more to this. A recent Equal Education survey, which looked at psychosocial support at schools after lockdown, revealed alarming results in the Western Cape. Approximately 2/3 of the pupils surveyed, 67%, indicated that there was no one at school who they could speak to if they felt scared or sad about something happening at home, at school or in their lives. And 72% said that when they returned to school, no one explained to them how they could access support if they were feeling sad or scared. And this has a massive impact on learners and their performance and our ability to prepare them for the future workplace. So we are going to be talking about the importance of this through the discussion as well. So I'd like to introduce our three panelists that we are going to be chatting to this morning. First, we've got Sarah Mtenso, who's the head of the Telkom Foundation. We're also going to be speaking to Omashani Naidu, who's the Executive Director of SchoolNet, and we'll be speaking to Len Kaywood, who's the Director of Childline Gauteng. So I'm going to kick the discussion off this morning by handing over to Sarah Mtenso, and I'm going to ask Sarah to please provide us with a short overview of Telkom's Connected Schools program and how the program has evolved over time. Thank you. Over to you, Sarah.
Good morning, and good morning to the colleagues on the line. Would you like me to switch on my my video?
Yes, please.
Let me do so. I hope everyone can see me. Okay, so as introduced, my name is Sarah Mtintso. I am actually an employee of Telkom looking after a portfolio called Corporate Social Responsibility, to which the foundation is one element of. And I'm quite excited to be part of the panel because I'm generally very passionate about education. And maybe just as a way of starting, in 2016, going into 2017, Telkom, through its foundation, had a very robust discussion internally. And part of the discussion was really triggered by our interest in wanting to make a very substantial contribution to education. And we, said to ourselves, we've been very extensively involved as the foundation insofar as education is concerned, but for some reason we weren't feeling that we're making the greatest of impact. So we had to step back and reflect on what it is that as the foundation we ought to be doing to see the kinds of desired outcomes that we had envisaged for ourselves. I think one of the challenges, and I don't want to repeat a number of the challenges that you've listed in your introductory Riyadh, but safe to say, as a company that has got substantive ownership by the South African government, we feel we have a responsibility to make an impact, but not only because the government of South Africa has got shareholding, but also because for us to thrive as a business, we have to make a contribution towards a thriving South Africa. And for us, education is a no-brainer. We feel very strongly that through education, we can empower a number of young people to be economically active. And that's where our basis for choosing education was. And quite extraordinary, we, in the past, we had taken a view that, we will do connectivity in schools, we will deploy assets such as, hardware, software, but we realized that a very one-dimensional approach to education does not really help us yield the kind of value that we so desire. So we spend a lot of time speaking to other corporates, we spend a lot of time speaking to government, we spend a lot of time speaking to NGOs, to learners and to teachers. And we came up with what we consider to be a very integrated strategy. And the strategy has got multiple components to it. So firstly, we move from the premise that the learner is our unit of change. So everything we do revolves and centers around the learner. And of course, without the teachers, you cannot have the success you desire on your learners. So we spoke and we reconfigured our strategy to also focus on teacher development, to which Omashni, who's a panelist here, will speak in detail around how we structured our teacher development, which is also a very critical component. Of course, we had a debate around how we infuse technology into our strategy. And I want us to be very clear that we never took a position that says technology is the solution to our problems. In fact, the way that we postured was that technology was really going to be an enabler to what we're seeking to do here. So when we introduce technology, which is why we introduced technology not only to learners, but also to teachers, because we felt it widens the horizon and it also just it gives both the teachers and the learners an opportunity to learn beyond and learn and teach, or rather just to improve the teaching practice and the learning experience on behalf of the learners. We then also felt, and it was based on our experience on the ground, that beyond just the teachers, we also needed to work with the school management teams, because the integration of technology in schools is not just a learner-teacher issue. It actually requires the whole school management to really just drive the integration in a way that becomes very seamless. So we invested quite a bit in making sure that the management of the schools fully understands the ability and the capability of technology and how that could be integrated to possibly impact outcomes of a particular school. So we spent quite a bit of time working with, I mean, you would know that the Department of Education has introduced quite a number of systems, whether that be SASEMs, data-driven dashboards. We found on the ground that these ideas are very removed from reality. So the teachers and the school management teams know about them, but they actually have not been sufficiently trained to understand. So we invested quite a bit of time in making sure that our leaders understand exactly how to use not just technology, but data as a currency to improve decision-making in schools. Then, of course, there were other things that we did, including introduction of digital skills. We've been quite instrumental as Telkom in framing some of the digital skills programs in various schools. So we've been teaching children on how to code, how to do robotics, and we've had very interesting insights here. So children who generally don't do well in certain subjects, once they get introduced to the art of coding, just their whole disposition towards education, how they deal with just developing and creating solutions towards problems becomes completely different. And very often it's not your brightest of children that get it. Even those that generally get left behind in the classroom actually become some of us our strongest coders, and we really are still trying to figure out, because I think there's a number of correlations we can draw. We've seen how some of the coding programs have positively impacted, for example, the ability to perform in mathematics. But for today's program, I wanted to also just zoom into two particular issues that we're speaking about here. One is the psychosocial element of the strategy. I mean, if you had asked me in 2014, I would have thought psychosocial is not the most critical, but over time, what we have realized is that it is absolutely impossible for children to flourish if and when their mental psychosocial development needs are taken care of. And we're very lucky to have had multiple partners that have embarked on this journey with us. Lynn will speak quite in a lot of detail around how we partnered with Childline in particular around delivering on a psychosocial program. And it is true, Riyadh, what you said earlier on about children not having the confidence, or schools in general not having the facilities to enable children to reach out for assistance insofar as psychosocial problems are concerned. So we've really been working quite hard in the last 5 years with a Childline to help us in that regard. And I don't want to steal Lynn's moment here, because I think she'll speak in greater detail around what that entails. I do need to conclude by saying teacher development is also and has always been a critical component of the foundation strategy. And the way that we've tackled teacher development is, again, we sought to put in technology as the lever to drive and improve the teaching practice. And we've been quite deliberate in working with SchoolNet in crafting the curriculum, delivering the curriculum, but also just helping teachers with basics around how to use technology to just change a learner's experience insofar as the quality of learning is concerned. I think, and we have seen, we've done an independent evaluation in the last year, focusing on the last 5 years of the strategy of the foundation, which we've now reviewed and better improved. My sense is that I think we've got a very strong model here, a model that says in order for you to achieve the outcomes that we desire, you need not look at just one component. Education is a critical part, but in it, you need to build a very strong ecosystem, because once you are able to touch a learner psychosocial development, empower the teacher, provide supplementary education, and all these things that I've mentioned, I think the likelihood of impacting the learner, impacting the teacher, but importantly, impacting the system is a lot higher and a lot greater than if you chose to just focus on one. And I don't think personally that Foundation or Telkom should be the only one involved in the delivery of this strategy. I think this creates an opportunity for us to look at opportunities for collaborating with others in this very multifaceted approach that we've taken. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you, Riyadh.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah. I'm going to And that was a great intro. I'm going to hand over to Amashani Naidu, and I'm going to start with a question to you, Amashani. What does the ideal sort of future classroom look like? And what does SchoolNet do to enable the transition? And what are some of the lessons you've learned working with technology in schools for so many years? Over to you, Amashani.
Thank you, Riyadh. Okay, so let's three-part question. Okay. I think the ideal future classroom is not, as you said initially, technology focused. I think the key sort of element is around fundamentally ensuring that the well-being of our children is in place. And part of that is to ensure that the learning dynamic is enhanced in the classroom activities. Part of that would be, yes, using technology where it is appropriate and using it in engaging ways to try and excite the learning, because we want children to have a love for learning. And one of the ways to do that is to encourage the use of technology. Part of that thinking, though, is considering how do you to balance, the way that we're doing teaching at the moment, which is not having the desired goals, with what the needs of the child is. And we have a number of fabulous opinions around what we want from the child post-schooling. But that inculcation of the art of learning comes from basic education. And part of that thinking must be in the classroom. And technology plays a huge role in what that looks like. So the short answer is a hybrid learning model where, for example, we are able to leverage of tools to ensure that the content we're teaching is taught in a pedagogically sound way, whilst at the same time giving the child the experience of digital and promoting lifelong skills. When it comes to, I think you asked about transitions, how has SchoolNet adopted this? The first level is for us to understand policy. And I think one of your poll questions there was around, what are the challenges? South Africa has fabulous policies. On paper, they are unsurpassed. Where we fall hugely short is in the implementation, and perhaps it's the understanding of how to implement. But it doesn't filter down to school-based learning. And for us, in many instances, it is trying to merge what we understand as the policy around digital technologies, digital frameworks, and trying to inculcate that immersively into the practice in the classroom. And that for us has been the goal. I mean, SchoolNet's been in existence for over 26 years, but our focus is on pedagogical skills, teaching the content that we want to do, but immersing that within a technology environment. And the reason for that is to ensure that we have children that are coming out of basic education with the resonant skills that are fit for purpose in a post-schooling world, whether it's higher education, whether it's entrepreneurship, the world of work, all of that is demanding that our children have digital skills. And if not through basic education, when will our children have it? Because at the moment, we're finding the majority of public sector schools, our learners are coming out of school on the back foot because they don't have the resonant expertise or skills to manage themselves in a world post basic education. Not sure if I answered all your questions there, Riyadh, but I'm sure we'll touch on it.
There's a couple that I'm going to dig into in a couple of seconds.
All
Thanks.
right.
You, Amashani and Sarah, you can leave your cameras on.
Okay.
Thanks. And then, Lynn, I'm going to turn over to you for the last opening question is, and I mentioned it a few minutes ago, when we talk about the future fit classroom, we have a tendency to gravitate towards the technology implementation side of things and all of that. But I mean, one of the big issues that Telkom did focus on was on the sort of learner resilience. Can you provide us with a broad overview of the work that was undertaken by Childline Gauteng in this regard? And why was it so important to focus on learner resilience in terms of moving towards this future fit classroom?
Riyadh, thank you very, very much to Trialogue for the opportunity to present the work that we did in the Telkom Schools project. And just to say that we were very honored to be involved in the program and very happy to talk about building resilience in children, families and communities, which has been Childline's main focus since 1987 in Gauteng. And just to say, that really the Telkom Schools project was absolutely a best practice model where they integrated various partners into delivering services for young people. They've spoken on the technology already, but there was also a leadership component from Columba leadership, which was really brilliantly executed, and we worked very well with the Columba leaders that were trained in the schools. Essentially, Childline's role was to place a social or a social auxiliary worker in each school. They were all overseen by professional social workers with regular supervision and training. We did individual counseling for youth, teachers and parents. We ran group work. So for the learners who did fall pregnant, we did teen parenting groups, we did adult parenting groups. Sadly, primarily as a result of COVID-19, we did grief and loss groups. And then we developed a positive masculinity group called Ringa Majita, Let's Talk Gents, to really encourage our young boys to think about their role in society and how they can play a positive role, dealing with gender-based violence, and then also sexual reproductive health rights, among other things. We did referrals for child protection services where there was child abuse or sexual violence, as well as some poverty alleviation in terms of helping learners to get IDs and referrals to SASA for grants, etc. And then we had the opportunity to go class by class and do assembly talk, raising awareness and preventing problems such as substance abuse, bullying, gender-based violence, a lot of work around safety and health issues around COVID-19, HIV/AIDS. And then we followed the annual calendar. So we celebrated things like Mother's Day, Father's Day, Youth Day, Human Rights Day, Freedom Day, and really just spoke to our learners about what those days mean, and a lot of information came from there. And then where possible, we were able to source resources such as food, parcels or school clothes, then also gave teacher and parent support. So essentially our role was to look at whole school development in terms of the emotional wellness of each particular school. And research has shown if a child, no matter how vulnerable, feels that there's one person in their life that really cares about them and pays attention, that they can overcome the difficulties and psychosocial, structural and economic challenges that are so greatly evident in our communities. So we played that role and were really able to touch children's lives quite deeply. We were able to see over 3,000 learners in that period of time. And I want to just thank Telkom because, I think it really is best practice to have a professional in the school, based at the school, who develops relationships with not only the learners, but parents and the teachers and the school management over time, and a special, a place where children can come and talk about what is troubling them. And very often, those can be resolved through intention and dealing with it in the appropriate way. So just to give you a short breakdown of what the major problems were that we dealt with, and apologies in advance because sometimes these topics that we talk about can be quite traumatizing and depressing for those outside of the system when they see what our children are dealing with. But Childline's motto is every child's story deserves a happy ending, and that we do whatever we can to make sure that our youth know that they are cared about. We dealt with the 872 children who needed academic support, and that ranged from dealing with anxiety around exams to study techniques to assisting them to focus on their schoolwork and their future and be able to develop to a point where they can make a contribution to their future, their family and their communities. Sadly, behavioral problems and substance abuse are very, very prevalent in most of our communities. We're grateful to our Premier, Latufi, who is tackling the issue of substance abuse in the province, but there were about just under 500 youth that we were able to deal with in that category. And then trauma is a very high level problem with just under 300 children who presented with post-traumatic stress symptoms, and that could be from domestic violence at home, exposure to crime, car accidents, children passing, and it is really, really important that we deliver services at the time or shortly after the trauma has occurred, because we do know that traumatic experiences do have an impact on brain development and the capacity of the child to learn and develop academically, unless it is treated as soon as possible. Sadly, child abuse, physical, sexual, and emotional, was our fourth highest category at 260 young people. Neglect and poverty is a real difficulty that our interventionists face on a regular basis. And it's very sad to see that so many of our children do not have their basic needs met. And then grief and loss was a really through us in terms of the number of family members that were dying from COVID, particularly during the last 4 or 5 years. And, you know, witnessing the impact on young people was very painful. We do know that orphans are very vulnerable in our country. But we do say, you know, thank God for the extended African family system, because the majority of those children were taken into family, which mitigated against their loss. And then a lot of our families, our adult generation, you know, still carry a lot of scars about their own trauma and their own past and the history of the country. And it's important that we work with the parents and the teachers, in fact, as well, to help them to deal with the pain of their problems. And then teenage pregnancy, unfortunately, was a factor. Bullying, and then mental health and suicide were also cases that we were able to intervene effectively and to assist. So I think if we, so those were the services that we were able to offer. And we're very grateful that we had such extensive exposure to the schools, that we are actually still in those schools till the end of the year. And, you know, just reading the case studies and going through the files, it really is very touching in terms of how children respond so positively when there is someone who does care and pays attention to their difficulties and troubles.
Well, thanks, Lynn. So I'm going to keep you on now because I do want to focus a little bit more on some of the tough lessons learned, and what's the sort of biggest lesson learned that you can communicate out to the attendees of this webinar in terms of the implementation of this program? What was the biggest challenge that you faced? And Omashani, that same question is coming to you shortly.
So really, you know, the absolute importance of having a professional social or social auxiliary worker placed in every school, I think is something that we as a country need to work towards. You know, we were very lucky that we had a very high staff retention rate in the project. And so the same social worker or social auxiliary worker stayed with the school for 5 years. They were able to build relationships with the school community, intervene when there were crises, such as death of learners, or, you know, bullying, and other major issues. And I think the really critical thing is to have a safe space where children, parents, and teachers can come and disclose what they are struggling with on an emotional level, and can, you know, engage in a process of healing to really restore their sense of self, back to being functional and able to, you know, make a positive contribution to the community. So that for me is absolutely bottom line. I think the other issue that we need to really grapple with is food security for learners. You know, Childline, we like to look at the whole child development from prenatal almost until adulthood, and to ensure that children's basic needs are met. And I think that's something that we need to, as a collective, continue to advocate for. So food security became a huge problem because of COVID and the school feeding schemes, etc. And that we would really encourage our partners to look at that issue of how we can get not just food security, but nutritional security, because we know that the developing brain is impacted very negatively by poor nutrition, as well as, you know, the impact of trauma has a major impact on the child's brain development. It needs urgent intervention, otherwise that, you know, those neural pathways become set for life, and you know, result in a very negative and damaging worldview, which then results in you know, children not living their optimal lives and being able to be fully participating in their school and community environment.
Amashani, I'm going to turn over to you. What were the biggest lessons that you guys learned in terms of implementing this program, and what would you kind of do differently?
Okay, I think the first element is to focus on leadership. Where the leadership is strong in a school, you have a greater degree of success. And for us, we saw this, you know, where principals were unafraid of challenging the status quo, and they would then be able to, you know, just guide the teachers into saying, you know what, the vision of the school is to be implementing ICT fully, and for us to get on board with that, which leads me to the next challenge, and which was basically the idea that we needed to change practice in the classroom. And I think in South Africa, as a generalization, teacher professional development has always been, you know, 2 hours, 4 hours, attend a training session, get a certificate, and that's the end of it. But we need to change that kind of thinking, where in this project particularly, it was around changing the practice. So yes, you attended a training, but what has been the consequence? What have you learned from that, and how have you changed your practice? And I think for the Telkom project particularly, it was around how do we foster that change and enable that change in the classroom, so the teacher, one, feels supported, but more importantly, they feel that they have the confidence to actually effect the change in the classroom itself. And I think that is the key sort of element. There's been a number of other challenges, you know, where time for teachers has been, let's say, I mean, there's been a number of programs since 2017 on, you know, teacher professional development, and on a yearly basis, there's been a range of different programs. But it's to understand that each teacher's journey in terms of professional development is their own, and some might get it. And we know this is the technology adoption curve. You know, some people adopt a lot faster because they see the vision and they are able to do it. But it doesn't mean that we must stop because only 10% are going to get it first time. It is about ensuring that we have mass integration. And how do we do that? It is through careful, considered support and love and care of our teachers as well as our children, because the goal is that education must be filled with hope. And for us to do that, we've got to ensure that the teachers are filled with confidence that they can still effect that kind of hope for our children in the classroom. So there's been a number of challenges, and I think one is attendance of workshops and making sure that teachers stay the course and understand that it's not just, you know, attending a training for a certificate. It is about enabling change, and this is where the leadership then becomes crucial, because they are the ones that hold teachers accountable and responsible for that change in the classroom. So yes, you attended these kinds of training workshops, but show me how it has changed your daily practice and behavior and attitude in the classroom. And that becomes the leadership, the school management team that actually showcases how that can work in a school. And I think this is what we saw most of all in the telecoms schools. And it was fabulous, because by year 3, you already had the bulk of the teachers moving into an ICT integrated sort of space. And you'll see the teachers will talk freely about, hey, you know what, when we came, we didn't have these WhatsApp groups, and you didn't have these. Now we communicate via email. We've got calendar notifications. We send all of our circulars via email. We don't need to print. We don't have to send a child with a notebook to all of the classrooms to sign that a teacher has received their correspondence, you know, and we still find that in other project schools. And I think what Telkom has done was really think about truly the life of the child. And that is now, because we're working with babies from the grade 8, it is not just grade 11 and 12 where the child is exiting the system. It is in grade 8 where we had a larger possibility of effecting change. And I think that for me was profound.
Thanks, Samshani. Sarah, I'm going to turn a bit of that question over to you. If you had to, based on the lessons that you've learned through this program, if you had to be starting out with exactly the same budget that you had in the same context, what are the elements that you would have done differently, and you know, what would you have enhanced? And I'm going to limit you to just a minute, because I've got a few questions in the Q&A I need to also bring up.
So, I mean, I think there's quite a lot of things, but I'll just limit myself to a few. So one of the first things I think we ought to have done and done properly is the element of change management. We must never underestimate. I mean, I think, you know, schools, teachers, learners are hungry to be assisted, but the manner in which you come into the schools is as critical as the outcomes you set for yourselves. And I think because there were so many elements that we needed to touch on, what we actually did not do very well, which if I were to think about doing again, would be to really embed the change management component as an integral part of this journey. Because I think once you structure your change journey, you are able to consistently manage where and track where people are at with regards to the journey. That's the one element. The second thing is this whole issue of integration of technology. I think we tend to be too quick to deploy without necessarily creating a fertile ground for the, you know, for the teachers and the learners to be excited and to want to adopt. So the one thing that we did as Telkom was we immediately when we went into the schools, we thought it was important for us to deploy technology in those schools. And if I were to do this program actually again, I would invest a lot more time making sure that we train, especially the teachers and the school management teams first on the art of technology, perhaps even creating a burning platform to help them understand why this technology is important before you actually put a device in front of the teacher. I think we need to really think about making sure that, yes, we must give the devices, but creating a very strong case for the deployment of these devices becomes, for me, much more important, so that by the time these devices land in the hands of the teachers or the school management teams, they have a very clear sense. Again, I think just to build on Omashni, one of the things that we picked up and Omashni and team did very well was that we had to really delineate and really understand that different teachers came with different levels of pre-existing knowledge. We tend to sometimes think that because the infrastructure doesn't exist in the schools, therefore all teachers don't know how to use computers. And if you don't do that segmentation and that due diligence in the beginning, you run the risk of bucketing and painting all the teachers with the same brush. And I think the segmentation becomes a critical element. I want to specifically focus on the psychosocial lesson, which I think for me was a very big eye-opener. So when we went, particularly in the schools in the Free State, I mean, in the Eastern Cape, we realized that because we wanted to deploy our social workers to assist, we never really thought about the fact that by virtue of having social workers in schools, children also, when they want to seek help, there's a lot of stigma attached to having to go see someone because you either have a problem or you are not well. And I think the one mistake we did in one of the schools was to locate the social workers very close to everybody's view, whether it was the learners, whether it was the teachers, whether it was the principals. And we, for a long time, did not understand why the number of learners accessing the service was so low, until we actually did a survey with learners and they said to us, going into that office, actually you are stigmatized because every child looks at you, every teacher looks at you, and they actually think you are the problem. So we needed to then do a lot of work with reorientating the learners, the teachers, and the school management teams to really view the importance of having the psychosocial services, not as a stigma necessarily, but as a way of just saying, there's nothing wrong with you not being able to deal with a problem or reaching out to a social worker. So some of those things may be considered very minor, but they actually impact whether and how children and teachers utilize those services.
Thanks, Sarah. I've got a question up here that's from Lerato Mogari. And Lerato asks, how do you deal with security at the school? It has been one of the big challenges in our projects. And I think that's probably applicable to both Lynn and Omashani. But I'm gonna start with Omashani and just ask that question, because I think that is an important one in the space that you're in. Was there any issues or concerns around the security?
Absolutely. I think for the Telkom project itself, there's been a number of elements that Telkom infused into the project itself. So, for example, Memeza, which was a security company, had alarm systems directly linked to the police station. The schools, where they could afford, had cameras strategically placed. At some time, we were thinking about how we could infuse microdot technology into the devices. Some of the options were to emboss, but the cost of doing such a thing, and many of our schools are a high risk entity and insurance is just astronomical, particularly for schools in terms of insuring devices themselves. But part of that was to then have discussions with the community as well. So there's buy-in around the technology being placed for the benefit of the community and in particular the child. And I think that has had more success than not. But I mean, in some of the schools that have been burgled, you would see that the school will say, you know what, no, but it wasn't the community members that came through. And in some cases, you know, devices were tracked. So I think that it's a mix. And I think security is an ongoing concern, not because it's criminal only. It is, I think, also a social justice where people think, you know what, I'm going to steal this thing, make you know, some money quickly, but they don't realize the consequence, obviously, of that theft having a lifetime effect on the children from whom they are stealing. So, you know, and these criminal types have been, what shall we say, very clever. I mean, you've got strong rooms and you've got locks, and these are ironclad, you know, doors, if you know, so people will drill across and you'll see that the whole door is removed. You know, the same for windows. So I think security does need to be tackled in a better way, and we need to understand what that looks like for South Africa. And I think that is a bigger conversation than just one that Telkom can solve, you know, but yeah, it is definitely an ongoing concern.
Thanks, Omashani. Lynn, I'm going to pose a question to you that's come from the chat and also related to what Sarah ended off on, around the stigmatization. And, you know, one of the lessons that Sarah mentioned is the need to physically locate the psychosocial support worker kind of in a more discreet manner. And Cynthia Trolli has said in the chat, same happens with nutrition programs in schools. Some learners, especially girls, do not eat at school because of the stigma that Nialambakini, your household staffs. So, I mean, there's a lot of stigmas associated with it. And what are the lessons, you know, related to that across not just the program that was run with the Telkom schools, but more broadly that you face? What are the lessons that you take out of that? And what can you communicate to other corporates that are on the line today in terms of how they design their programs better?
Absolutely, Riyadh. You know, it's really important that there is a little room that is made available in a private space, you know, for psychosocial services, and for us to address the issues of stigma around feeding schemes and so on. There's no shame in poverty. It's not the learner's responsibility. And I think the other thing that goes a very long way to addressing that issue is the fact that the social auxiliary worker in the school has a relationship which is built over many years with the teachers, the principals, and the learners. So she becomes part of that school community, and it becomes a normal, natural thing to, you know, to say that if you have a difficulty, that's what you do. And, you know, and there's no shame in asking for help. You know, this thing that we must all be independent and sort out our own problems is not realistic in a situation where there are so many issues. So yeah, definitely, I think it's through a quiet space, as well as developing relationships and addressing the issue openly in the school classrooms to take that sense of stigma away.
So I just want to dig into that a little bit more, Lynn. Your recommendation is kind of to address the stigma, as opposed to should we locate the kind of the social worker separately?
So it's both. I think, you know, being part of the school, even if it's sort of a small zozo under a tree in the far corner where, you know, there is a level of privacy and quietness and a sense of space and safety for the learner or the parent who accesses that service. So, you know, in terms of crime and impacting on the schools, yes, we know there were 1.6 million crimes reported to SAP. I think it was in 2022. So our children are living in a very violent society where a lot of those crimes were violent, and being exposed to a sense of lack of law and order that seems to be par for the course. So it's something that I think that as elders and leadership in school communities that we really, really need to address in terms of the safety of learners, but not only physically, but also emotionally. Creating a safe space at schools for learners and indeed the entire community is something that we need to continue to advocate and lobby for, and bring in all partners, whether it be SAPs or municipalities, to ensure that children know that they're living in a country where they are cared about, they are important, and they are on our agenda, and that the adult generation will do the absolute utmost to keep them safe, emotionally and physically and sexually, in fact.
Sure. Thanks. Sarah, I just realized we're on the last 2 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick round up. And, unfortunately with these webinars, the discussion tends to get into it in the last couple of minutes. Sarah, I'm going to start with you, and I'd like to know kind of more broadly than just telecom, what are the biggest mistakes that you think corporates do tend to make when they're designing some of the school interventions? And then I'm going to ask a separate question to Mashani and Lynn, but over to you, Sarah, as a wrap-up question.
Yeah, thanks. I think the biggest challenge we have as corporates generally is that we're very fragmented in our approach. So each one wants to almost do the same thing without, seeking to collaborate. If you just look at the telecommunications space, you would have heard that the work that we do is similar to the work that the other competitors are doing. But there's very little appetite for us to say, hold on, let's sit down and let's find a way of just amalgamating all our efforts and making sure that we have greater impact. I think if we can find a way of looking beyond competition, because in social impact, there's no competition. We all have the same vision. We want all our learners to prosper. We want South Africa to prosper. It's not about the money. It's about how you really mobilize and galvanize your resources towards driving greater change. So if we could find ways of collaborating. I think the second thing for me is that we always have to be very careful not to assume that the solutions to addressing the challenges in education lie with us. We actually always have to posture as facilitators and not as solution bearers. I think very often, because we come with big bags, we come with all these great things, we tend to think that what we say must always go. And I think if we can posture differently and come to a point where the voice of the teacher, the voice of the learner, the voice of the community becomes a lot more audible, I think we probably will find a lot more solutions than we are as we are doing these things on our own. I mean, I listened to Omashani's response when she speaks about security. For me, the greatest value you get in security is by involving the community. If the community understands that these assets are to the betterment of that community, it doesn't matter what physical security you put in place. If the community buys into this is for us, you've solved 90% of the problem. So I think the voices of the stakeholders must actually be a lot more audible than our voices, regardless of how much money we put on the table. So I'll stop at those two, because I think for me, those are the two important ones.
Cool, thanks. And then I'm going to do one last comment from Omashani. What would you say is the most critical success factor, the single, I'm going to put you on the spot, the single biggest most critical factor when it comes to designing sort of future fit interventions?
There's many, but let me speak fast so I can address them all. I think the key element is to understand that it is not one part of a program. You can't just do education without psychosocial. And I think Sarah articulated this really well, where you have to have all parts of the puzzle if you are tackling an issue at a school. And we need to be more considered in our approach of how we do that. And to understand that whilst quick wins easy for us to checklist and tick box, it is not about that. When we're working in education, it is about development and support in a kind and gentle way that moves people to build their confidence, build their independence, and get them to a stage where they are critical thinkers about their own situation, and allowing them the opportunity to be free thinking in that experience. And I think that for me is just most profound. You can't go into a project thinking you know it all and look at the solution I'm providing and you just take it and, you know, be wonderful and be an expert teacher tomorrow. It is about understanding how we do development and understanding that our teachers and our children are there with experience, with expertise, and we need to provide contextually relevant programs for our schools that deal with the environment that our teachers and children and parents and the community at large are facing as a whole.
Thanks so much, Shani. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for your time. We really appreciate it. And I think there's quite a few lessons coming out of this that's useful. The webinar write-up will be made available on the Trialogue Knowledge Hub. And I'd also just like to say in closing, again, thank you to everybody that joined, all of the attendees, and to everyone on this webinar. Please, if you are an NPO, please complete our NPO survey. And for the corporates, please make sure that you've completed our corporate questionnaire, because all of that feeds into the research that informs a lot of the discussions in it. So please go ahead and do that. And thank you so much for your time, and apologies, we've run 2.5 minutes over. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Ibram, Sarah, and all. Have a lovely day. And remember, you can call 116 Childline 24/7 if you have any psychosocial problems, and we will do our